real pleasure to be here, and an exciting topic. As many of you would know, having an interest, and even a positive interest, in the possibilities of European political collaboration is increasingly a minority position in this country. A little more than 20 years ago, there was some enthusiasm, okay? There was a belief that some of the people present in this room shared that Norway might actually join this incredibly civilizing project of Europe. And why is it civilizing? To someone like me, it's not so much because of the opening up of markets. That may be good for the economy, but not necessarily for the people. I mean, things which are good for the economy are not necessarily good for the people. No, it was because of the idea of a political animal which was of a new kind, where everybody belonged to a minority. And nothing is more civilizing than belonging to a minority, realizing that you can't always have your way. Sometimes you will have to compromise. Sometimes you will have to settle for the second best option because there are others who want something different. So in other words, being member of Europe, the way we saw it at the time, was comparable perhaps to living in a postmodern family. You know, and the civilizing, as it were, aspects of this, where you cannot always have your way. It seems such a long time ago now, those early 1990s. There was an upbeat sentiment around the world. Remember, this was the time when we had just, as it were, Eastern Europe had just been liberated from the single-state authoritarian communist system. Apartheid had been, you know, was on its way to oblivion in South Africa, and everybody knew this in the early 1990s. It was a time when the internet and the mobile phones came into the world. In other words, the early 1990s, in many ways, signaled the beginning of a new era. And somehow this era is still with us. But there are signs of fatigue, okay? And there is much less enthusiasm, and there is much more cynicism regarding all sorts of optimistic projects. We now have a world where politics is largely driven not by enthusiasm for the future, but by fear and anxiety. You know, where people try to win elections by promising to fight terrorism or illegal immigration or climate change or Ebola or some other insidious threat facing humanity. Not by saying that we are now here, in 30 years we're going to be there. It's going to be incredibly difficult, but it will be wonderful, and we are going to create a new and better world. When did you last hear a politician talk like that? Maybe in 1992, I'm not sure. There would have been some. And nowadays they would have quickly been, as it were, taken down by TV comedians, cynical TV comedians, who would have told them how silly they were. So in other words, this is a time in which we live now. There are challenges, not only to democracy in Europe, but indeed there are some very severe challenges facing humanity as a whole, as you would know. We live in a time of what I call in my own work accelerated change. Accelerated change. Things are happening really fast. And in many places around the world, there is a feeling in communities that things are changing really fast, but nobody asked me for my opinion. You see? And these changes were not instigated by my community or by the people I know. They come from outside, and they're imposed on us. And we are being somehow overrun by these changes. Sometimes these changes create opportunities, jobs, you know, possibilities of getting somewhere. A new road, okay, makes it possible for you to smuggle goods across the border, which was formerly very difficult because you had to sort of walk through the jungle with that stuff, and there were poisonous snakes and whatnot in the jungle. Okay, now you can drive across the border to Guinea or some other country. If we now talk globally, okay, I'll very quickly move to Europe. So sometimes it gives opportunities. Sometimes people feel overrun in a much more negative way, in the sense that they face what we could call, and what I tend to call sometimes, okay, a crisis of reproduction. A crisis of reproduction, which refers to the fact that many people around the world feel that I am no longer able, or we are no longer able to be the people we want to be. We're no longer able to reproduce ourselves on our own terms. We are being forced to be something that we feel that we are not. And as a result of this, it's a very simple psychological reaction. We get withdrawals, various forms of withdrawal. Right? Withdrawal into religious communities, into nationalism, attempts to recreate a kind of equilibrium, a kind of autonomy, of control, which has been lost. It's perfectly understandable. And what's the result? What's the cause of this? Well, let me just take, okay, now we move quickly on to Europe, because as several of the other speakers have said, there's limited time, and that's why I speak so fast. I mean, so that I can try to cover 45 minutes in 20 minutes and a half, okay? So let's see how it goes. Okay, that's a framework. Real serious challenges to do with a sense of alienation, uncertainty, fear, you might say the tension or the contradiction even between the requirements of economic growth and the demands for ecological sustainability, which is fundamental. And there's no simple solution. There are people who want us to believe that there is a simple solution, either because there isn't a problem. I mean, there are certain irresponsible people who still say that there isn't a problem, or who say that we just have to tweak the economy a little bit so that to turn it a bit more, make it a little bit more green, and then we can go on with business as usual. But it's not true. I mean, neither of these two solutions are true. It's going to be hard, okay? It's going to be really difficult to find a way to survive the 21st century without very serious crisis, and everybody sort of knows this, okay? So that's, you know, I'm not going to solve that problem here. I'm just placing it in front of you and reminding ourselves of the fact that there is this contradiction. I mean, the carbon economy has served us so well for 200 years. The carbon economy, starting around the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and it has led to fantastic growth. I mean, in almost everything, every realm you can imagine. And now we've reached a point where we realize that we're somehow undermining the conditions of our own existence by continuing with the carbon economy. So we need to think really fast and devise new ways of thinking about development and progress, which are not based on increased use of fossil fuels. So there is a real big challenge here. But and this is part of the context, okay? It's part of the context for the crisis of identity. This uncertainty, the risk, the fact that we don't really think much about the future because it's scary. And that's not a good situation in which to be. Now, in tribal societies, this is part two, okay? Part two. In tribal societies, there are basically two principles of political identity, kinship and place. And they sometimes come into conflict with each other. For example, if you live in a village where you are related through kinship to some of the people who live in the village, but there are others who live in the same village to whom you are not related. And that may create a role conflict if there is a conflict between your tribal group and someone else's, because you don't want to go to war against your neighbor, right? And he belongs to group B, he belongs to the other group. So you'll find, one will then find in tribal societies mechanisms of conflict resolution that make it possible for people to live next to each other in spite of the fact of not being related. Kinship and place. And one thing which is quite thought-provoking is that in the theory of nationalism of the modern contemporary world, we see the exact same two principles at play, kinship and place. Kinship in the guise of ethnicity, the idea of the ethnic nation. We belong to one nation because we all have the same origins. We have the same roots, right? And we're all, you know, descendants of, in this country, it will be Harold Fairhair or, you know, some such mythical or semi-mythical figure, okay? So it's the ethnic idea of the nation. And on the other hand, the jus solis, right? You have the jus sanguinis, the rule of the blood. And then you have jus solis, all right? The rule of the place. We belong to the same nation because we live in the same place, you know? So those are the two main principles of political nationalism, which almost exactly mirror the two principles of political cohesion in tribal societies. So clearly there's something essential there. But of course, both kinship and place can mean lots of things. But let's just focus on place for now, because this is really about what kind of place is Europe. A place can be big and it can be small. For a long time, these places that we were talking about, which created a sense of solidarity, which produced corporate groups, right? Which made people go out of their way to do each other favors, to sacrifice, which created bonds of loyalty and of commitment and of moral obligations. They were quite small, and they were, for a long time in human prehistory and early history, based on face-to-face interaction and knowledge, right? So people actually knew each other. But they grew, right? They grew. And the most phenomenal growth of place, which should be a source for optimism, is that which is illustrated through the, and epitomized in the, you might say, the cognitive revolution given to us by the printing press, the revolution of the printing press, which in the space of just a few decades enabled people around Europe mostly at the time to identify with people they had never met, right? It's an enormous growth. It represents an enormous growth in the scope of your collective identity. Now, nation building as such took a bit longer, right? It took a bit longer. But already, I mean, as early as the late 16th century, people in Hamburg would know that there were people in Munich who had read some of the same books or who had been exposed to some of the same ideas. And therefore, one had a sense of a cultural community. Not yet a political community. That came much later in Germany, but a sense of a cultural community. In other words, the expansion of place from the concrete to the abstract is part of our modern history. And the notion about Europe, the idea about Europe was that this expansion could continue. That was part of the idea, that this expansion could continue and could grow into a shared European identity. And this was very much the order of the day in the early 1990s. I mean, there are a couple of caveats here, and I'll take those immediately since we don't have a lot of time. One, around 1994, I was at an anthropology conference somewhere in another part of Europe with colleagues from the then recently liberated Central Eastern Europe. And there were some brochures lying around in the lobby of a hotel, okay, from Brussels. Which depicted happy young people from different European countries smiling, young, beautiful people smiling at the camera. And quite clearly, some of them were from Southern Europe, some looked very Scandinavian, etc. And they were all smiling and waving at the camera. And my colleague looked at it and she said, well, we've seen this before, haven't we? I mean, after all, we've been subjected to Stalinist propaganda throughout our lives. So that was her take on it. This is a top-down approach. It's a top-down project. There are some people up there in some high office who have no contact, as it were, with real life, excuse me, who want us to develop a shared identity. And they try to conjure that identity into being by creating these brochures. But it's ultimately vacuous and nothing to do with lived experience. Now, okay, that was that's part two. It's contested to what extent this place can grow and what kind of place it can turn into. Should it be a place based on similarity, or should it rather be a place based on complementarity? Should it be a place ruled in one place, in one center, or should it be based on what we in the early 1990s still spoke of as subsidiarity, the principle of subsidiarity? The Greeks are never going to become German. I mean, it may or may not have been a good idea for them to have a shared currency. I'm not commenting on that, okay? May or may not have been a good idea for them to have a shared currency. But it's not enough, okay? And it's not enough to take part in the same institutions. The Greeks are never going to become Germans. And did it ever occur to you that nobody had even entertained the thought that it might be possible that the Germans might become a little bit more Greek? Right? No, they didn't, you know. The Germans would never become Greek, but the Greeks should become German. They should get up in the morning, like good Protestants, go to work, pay the taxes, pay their parking tickets, etc. We've now realized that difference is not going away. So there will have to be complementarity, and perhaps one should revitalize the old idea about subsidiarity for the reasons that I'm now going to talk a little bit about. Because what we see, the crisis of identity that we see around Europe these days, which is expressed, among other things, through the rise of right-wing populism, is in some ways the result of a healthy impulse, a healthy anti-authoritarian impulse. The feeling, which is perfectly justifiable and correct, that someone else is taking decisions which have effects on my life, and they didn't ask me for my opinion. And who those someone else is, I don't know. But the most convenient thing is to blame immigrants. Because they're close at hand and I can see them, and some of them seem to be doing quite well, while I'm not. Or to blame multiculturalism and the cosmopolitan elites out of touch with reality. I'd say that, you know, the list of complaints is reasonable, but it's sent to the wrong address. It's a version of, you know, the wrong address theory that we sometimes talk about in theories of nationalism. Why the complaints are relevant is because what we are witnessing is what I call a clash of scales. A clash of scales. You have one scale, which is the economy, the internal market, plus increasingly a globalized market. And then you have one scale, which is politics. And several have already commented upon. I mean, Emily just said that, you know, the turnout for the European election wasn't incredibly impressive. Probably because people feel that they don't really have a say. I mean, it's simply too far away. I mean, it's nothing to do with my life. So you have that scale, which is a large scale, and then you have the scale which is my personal life, which is on a very low and local scale, and where the concern is, how am I going to get by? How am I going to create a safe, materially secure future for my children? Who will help me find a job if I get unemployed? And how can I walk home at night without the fear of being mugged? You know, these very local concerns. And there's a huge gap between these local concerns and the workings of the economy and of politics. I mean, George Monbiot once quipped, I mean, he's not always very accurate, but he's always very good, you know, with his turns of phrase. And he once said that nowadays, in the 21st century, everything has been globalized except democracy. And there is a truth to that. I mean, it's not entirely, you know, accurate, but there is a truth to it. And the clash of scales I'm talking about is to do with this. The feeling that people have around Europe that they're being overrun by decisions, either non-decisions or decisions which have been taken far away at a higher level of scale and which affects me. And where my feeling of autonomy is being threatened. I no longer feel autonomy. I no longer feel in charge of my life. I cannot decide. I cannot take the decisions I would have wanted to take. And remember that populism, which I said it arises from a healthy impulse, the healthy impulse of anti-authoritarianism, anti-centralism, the wish to decide your own destiny. It comes in many flavors. I mean, in our country, we have a tradition, now dormant, of left-wing populism, based in the districts, egalitarian, socialist populism, associated with people like Ottar Brox, you know, who wrote a book in the 1960s and was later a member of parliament for the Socialist Left Party in the 1970s. So you have that ecologically oriented left-wing populism, which is anti-centralist. But of course, nowadays, everybody talks about right-wing populism. And I think it's very important when we try to deal with these tendencies, which are quite dangerous and which are very divisive, you know, divisive identity politics, right? Based on an us and them logic. And us and them logic. It's very important not to confound the symptoms with the causes. The problem is not that certain people, or people, as it were, are bigoted, racist, narrow-minded, etc., that they withdraw. Or in the case of certain immigrants, that they're fundamentalist, medieval in their attitudes, etc. That's a symptom, but it's not the cause. And the cause is a loss of autonomy and the feeling that, as I say, a gap of scales where decisions, there's a gap between your lived experience and decisions which affect your lived experience. And this is the real source of the crisis of autonomy. Now, there are two more concepts that I'd like to introduce. I said clash of scales. Okay, that is, to me, a key explanation for the weakening of legitimacy. And it may be solved, maybe it may be solved through a more thorough and a more consistent implementation of the principle of subsidiarity. But that principle of subsidiarity will then also have to include the economy, possibly. Okay, so let me plant another concept. Maybe one might rethink what the economy is. And some people have done so in Southern Europe simply because they can't find a job. So, I mean, there are Greeks who now return to the olive plantation or you know, to the olive farm that their grandparents used to have because there aren't jobs for them in Athens. And there are people in Spain who are now, again, like they did in the 30s, experimenting with various forms of cooperatives and different ways of getting by economically. On the margins, or even outside the formal economy of the market. So perhaps one could think that, yes, the economy could be about the generating profits for corporations and increasing your GDP. It could be about that. But it could also be about satisfying human needs. And maybe if you decide at the outset that the point of the economy is to satisfy human needs, that will generate a very different approach, and you will see very different things when you look around than if you have decided once and for all that the good thing about a healthy economy is that it generates profits for corporations and that it leads to a growth in the GDP. So that's the second concept I'd like to plant here, is that of the human economy, which is already, talking about civil society, which is already developing in certain parts of Southern Europe simply because there's no alternative. Tina, there is no alternative, as Mrs. Thatcher said. Well, there is no alternative in the formal sector, so they have to find alternatives and develop their own alternatives outside. A different kind of reaction. to identity politics, which is a reaction of withdrawal and resentment and suspicion and hatred. Okay, the third, since we're running out of time, the third concept I'd like to mention is to do with the ways in which we can think about this identity. Now, withdrawal into closed identity groups is generally a bad idea in the globalized world. Because we need, as someone else spoke about before the coffee break, we need these bridges, we need translation, cultural translation, crucial if we're going to be capable of living together in this next century. And not just translations of languages, but translations of life worlds, so that we can actually see that, bloody hell, I mean, the Germans have their way of life. Well, they have many ways of life. And Greeks also have many ways of life, and there are differences. And we're going to have to live with those differences, like it or not. And so the final concept that I'd like to so that's withdrawal into these closed identities, which we see not only in Europe, we see it also. I mean, look at what's taking place in the near Middle East. I mean, in northern Syria and Iraq. They talk about withdrawal into closed systems. Very dangerous, very divisive, and really not to be recommended. But the opposite option, namely the dream of world domination, is probably also not a good strategy. I mean, we live in a part of the world which has been dominated by Christianity, and the dream of Christianity has forever been world domination. I mean, you can't really sleep well at night until the entire world has been converted and has been, you know, saved. Okay, and the bad news is that in the globalized world, we are confronting another religion where there are people who have some of the same ideas. You know, we can't really sleep well at night until everybody has heard the message of the Prophet and has been brought into the Ummah, the global Ummah. So religions which dream about world domination, similarly a bad idea. Now, why am I saying this? Because certain ideas about Europe are about similarity. But a healthy society and a healthy community is not about the reproduction or the replication of similarity, but about the organization of diversity, right? Organization of diversity. And here we Europeans may have something to learn from the Hindu world, right? I'm not saying that we should adopt the caste system, okay? And I probably don't think we should. We can discuss that later. That's not the point. But the point is that Hinduism is based on the recognition of diversity, that it's complementary, that difference is a good thing. And in anthropology, which is my subject, we always say, I mean, to the first-year students that, okay, if we want to study humanity, the only way of doing it is by studying humans. And what humans are is first and foremost different from each other. So let's start there. So in other words, in this world, which is overheated, as I call it, marked by accelerated change, lots of uncertainty, lots of unsolved problems. At least, let's try not to commit the same errors that we've done in the past. And here I talk about anything from dreams of world domination to the replication of similarity, and I guess to the carbon economy. Instead, a starting point could be a cosmopolitan approach. And what do I mean by cosmopolitanism? It's a fairly empty, it's a vacuous term, you know, cosmopolitanism. I mean, it sounds like, you know, some elite chatter, you know. The benefactors of globalization, those who travel the world, who speak many languages, who meet like-minded people, who are really thriving, you know, in this globalized world. Unlike those localized people who don't speak languages, whose skills don't travel, and who feel marginalized because of being outcompeted by Chinese and by immigrants. I mean, let's just think about those people for a moment as well. No, that's not what I mean by cosmopolitanism. By cosmopolitanism, I simply mean what I started this talk with, namely the fact that the civilizing, the fundamentally civilizing aspect of Europe is not that of the free market. It's not that of economic growth. It may not even be that of free mobility of people, although that's a good thing. No, the most civilizing aspect of the European project is the fact that everybody has to reconcile themselves with the fact that they belong to a minority. And that in democracy, you cannot always have your way. You have to compromise, and you have to make concessions, and you have to realize that other people who live in a different part of the continent, who speak a different language, who eat different food, that they have the same rights as you, and they can actually vote you down at a certain point. So cosmopolitanism builds on the realization that to some extent we live in different worlds. Greeks and Germans, Norwegians and Spaniards, we live in different worlds, to some extent. To a certain extent we do. But we can communicate quite well across those differences, and it's much easier. Cross-cultural, intercultural communication is far easier than many people want us to believe. We can easily understand each other. But the fact that we can communicate across these boundaries and understand each other does not give an ultimate guarantee of consensus. In other words, it doesn't mean that we will eventually agree. Even though I'm able to communicate my views to you, and I go on with it for years, it doesn't mean that you're sooner or later going to agree with me. And here, not least in this country, we have a lesson to learn. Because, I remember, I'm not giving names now, okay? But I remember listening to the radio a couple of years ago after an election, and there was one of the parties which had done really badly in the election. And then the party secretary, it was not Mr. Raymond Johansen, okay? It was another party secretary from another party who came on radio and tried to explain this. And he said on radio, well, maybe it was because we didn't get our message properly through. We didn't get our message across to the voters. And I said to myself, shit, I'm sure that's exactly what they did. So the voters got the message and voted for other parties. That's a cosmopolitan view. You can understand me, but we're not going to agree, but we have to live together in this shrinking, overheated world, divided as we are by a shared destiny. So on that note, I thank you for your attention, and good luck with Europe.